The massive hall buzzed with the sounds of 1,000 different voices. Creatures from across the galaxy filled the enormous space, their bodies strange and wonderful in ways that would have amazed any human who saw them. Some walked on 4 legs, others floated through the air. A few had tentacles instead of arms. Many had eyes that glowed like small stars in the dim light. This was the Grand Assembly of the Galactic Federation, where representatives from 500 worlds came together once each month to discuss the business of ruling space. Today felt like any other day. The delegates talked about trade routes and mining rights. Someone complained about pirates near the Outer Rim. Another delegate wanted to change the rules about importing exotic foods. Commander Zekthara sat in the back rows, saying nothing. His silver scales caught the light as he shifted in his seat. Scars covered his reptilian face and arms, each one telling a story of battle. He had served the Velthari Empire for 40 years, fighting in wars that most beings only heard about in stories. His people were known throughout the galaxy as the finest warriors alive. When the Velthari went to war, other species surrendered rather than face them in battle. But today, Zekthara looked different. His yellow eyes stared at nothing, lost in memories that seemed to trouble him. The other delegates paid him no attention. They knew him as a hero who had conquered dozens of worlds for his empire. They respected him, but they also knew he rarely spoke during these meetings. The current speaker was a tall, thin creature with blue skin and too many arms. She was discussing the latest reports from the exploration fleets. New worlds had been found. New species had been contacted. Most had joined the Federation peacefully, happy to trade and learn from more advanced civilizations. Then she mentioned something that made several delegates laugh. We have also made contact with a species that calls itself human. They come from a small world they call Earth, located in what they call the Orion arm of the galaxy. Our scouts report that they have just learned to travel between stars, though their technology is still very basic. More laughter filled the hall. First contact with primitive species always amused the delegates. They remembered when their own worlds had been young and simple. The blue-skinned delegate continued. The humans appear to be friendly, but not very advanced. They have spread to perhaps 20 worlds, building small colonies. Their largest settlement has fewer than 2 million individuals. Their weapons are chemical-based projectiles and simple energy devices. Our experts believe they could be useful as servants or perhaps entertainment. A delegate from the gas giant. Worlds floated forward. His voice sounded like wind through metal pipes. Perhaps we should offer them junior membership in the Federation. They could handle basic labor while learning from their betters. An excellent suggestion, agreed another voice. This came from a creature that looked like a walking crystal formation. Young species often make eager students. We could teach them proper civilization. The discussion continued in this manner for several minutes. The delegates spoke about humans the way farmers might discuss a new type of livestock. Some suggested using them for mining operations. Others thought they might be good at manufacturing simple goods. A few wondered if humans could be trained for military support roles, though everyone agreed they would never make real soldiers. During all of this talk, Commander Zekthara sat perfectly still. His claws slowly extended and retracted, a sign that those who knew him would recognize as extreme agitation. His breathing became deeper, and the scales along his neck began to change color, shifting from silver to a darker, more dangerous hue. Finally, he could listen no more. Zekthara stood up slowly. His massive frame towered over the smaller delegates around him. At nearly 8 feet tall and covered in battle scars, he commanded attention even when he said nothing. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire hall like thunder. Honored delegates, he began, his words careful and measured. I request permission to address the assembly regarding the species known as humans. The current speaker paused, surprised. Commander Zekthara almost never participated in general discussions. His expertise was warfare, not diplomacy. But his reputation commanded respect, and she nodded for him to continue. Thank you, Zekthara said. He walked down from the back rows, his heavy footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Every eye in the hall followed him as he made his way to the speaking platform. When he reached it, he stood quietly for a long moment, as if gathering his thoughts. 3 years ago, he began, I commanded a battle fleet of 12 vessels. We were conducting routine expansion operations in the sector that humans call the Orion Arm. My orders were simple. Locate and annex any world suitable for Velthari colonization. It was the kind of mission I had completed dozens of times before. He paused, his yellow eyes scanning the assembled delegates. We discovered a human settlement on a world they had named New Haven. Our initial scans showed a colony of approximately 50,000 individuals. They had basic agriculture, some mining operations, and simple manufacturing. No military installations were detected. No fleet defenses. No advanced weapons. Several delegates nodded. They sounded exactly like what they expected from humans. According to all standard protocols, Zekthara continued, this should have been a simple annexation. We would arrive, demonstrate our superior technology, demand surrender, and add another world to the Velthari Empire. The entire operation should have taken no more than a few days. His voice grew quieter, forcing the delegates to lean forward to hear him clearly. I have fought in 17 major conflicts during my 40 years of service. I have conquered worlds defended by advanced civilizations. I have faced enemies with weapons that could destroy stars and fleets that numbered in the thousands. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened at New Haven. The hall was completely silent now. Even the constant background noise of alien conversations had stopped. Every being present sensed that they were about to hear something important. The humans had a colony administrator named Jake Morrison, Zekthara said. Before becoming a civilian leader, he had served in Earth's military forces. They also had a medical officer called Lisa Grant, who served as their strategic planner. A mining foreman named Danny Walsh had been expanding their underground facilities, and a teacher named Maria Santos handled their communications. He let those names hang in the air for a moment. To the delegates, they were just strange sounds, alien names from a primitive world. But the way Zekthara spoke them suggested they carried much more weight. These 4 individuals, he continued, along with their fellow colonists, would teach me something about warfare that 40 years of experience had not. There are enemies, more dangerous than those with superior weapons or greater numbers. The most dangerous enemy is one that refuses to accept defeat. Zekthara's scales had now shifted to a deep, dark color that most delegates had never seen before. Among his own people, this was the color of deep respect mixed with fear, the color a warrior showed when speaking of an enemy worthy of legend. Honored delegates, he said, his voice growing stronger. You speak of humans as if they were simple creatures suitable for labor or entertainment. You discuss them as if they were children to be taught proper civilization. You make plans for them as if they were resources to be managed. He looked directly at the delegates who had been laughing earlier. I am here to tell you that every assumption you have made about humanity is wrong. Not just incorrect, but dangerously, catastrophically wrong. The silence in the hall became even deeper, if such a thing were possible. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. What I am about to tell you, Zekthara concluded, is the story of how 50,000 humans on a single world taught the Velthari Empire to fear. It is the story of how a species you consider primitive changed the way an entire galaxy thinks about warfare. And it is the story of why no one dreaded humans until now. He stepped back from the speaking platform and looked out over the assembled delegates one final time. If you will permit me, I will tell you about the siege of New Haven, and why the galaxy must never again make the mistake of underestimating humanity. Commander Zekthara walked back to the center of the speaking platform. The massive hall remained completely quiet. Every delegate waited to hear what the famous Velthari warrior would say next. His dark scales slowly shifted back to their normal silver color as he began to speak again. My flagship was called the Dominion's Fist, he said. It was the pride of the Velthari fleet, armed with particle beam weapons that could crack a planet's crust. 11 other warships followed behind me as we entered the New Haven system. Each vessel carried enough firepower to destroy a small moon. He paused, remembering that day. According to our intelligence reports, the humans had been on New Haven for only 3 years. They had arrived in slow generation ships, the kind that take decades to travel between stars. Our scouts had watched them build simple farms and dig basic mines. They had no orbital defenses, no military bases, no weapon factories. Several delegates nodded. This matched everything they knew about human capabilities. Standard protocol. For annexing a primitive world is simple, Zekthara continued. You arrive in force, establish orbital control, and transmit a surrender demand. Most species immediately submit when they see superior technology. Those few who resist usually change their minds after a demonstration of power. He looked out. At the assembled beings, I sent the standard message to New Haven. It was translated into basic human language and transmitted to their main settlement. The message was simple. Surrender your world to the Velthari Empire, and your people will be relocated to suitable reservation areas. Refuse and face the consequences. Zekthara's yellow eyes grew distant as he remembered what happened next. Most primitive species take days or even weeks to respond to first contact. They need time to understand what they are facing, time to argue among themselves, time to accept their fate. But the humans of New Haven responded in less than 4 hours. This surprised several delegates. Even advanced civilizations usually needed more time to formulate a response to Velthari demands. The message came from Jake Morrison, their colony. Administrator Zekthara said. But what shocked my communications officer was not the speed of their response. It was the language they used. He let that statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. The humans spoke perfect Velthari. Not the broken phrases that most species manage after years of study, but fluent, grammatically correct Velthari. With proper military terminology, a few delegates shifted uncomfortably. Learning an alien language in 4 hours should have been impossible for any primitive species. Morrison's message was polite but firm. Zekthara continued. He said, and I remember his exact words, Commander, we appreciate your interest in our world, but we must respectfully decline your offer. New Haven is our home, and we intend to keep it that way. Hope you will understand our position and withdraw peacefully. The Velthari commander's voice took on a harder edge. No primitive species had ever refused a Velthari annexation demand. In 40 years of expansion, every world we had claimed either surrendered immediately or fell within days of bombardment. The idea that 50,000 humans would defy an entire battle fleet seemed impossible. He began pacing slowly across the platform, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silent hall. I decided to demonstrate the futility of resistance. My fleet targeted an uninhabited moon in the New Haven system and destroyed it completely. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface, a clear message about what would happen if they continued to defy us. Zekthara stopped pacing and faced the delegates directly. Within 2 hours, we received another transmission. This time it came from Dr. Lisa Grant, their medical officer. Again, she spoke perfect Velthari, but her message was different from Morrison's diplomatic response. The scales began to darken slightly as he remembered Grant's words. She said, Commander Zekthara, we have analyzed your demonstration. Your weapons appear to be fusion-based particle beam arrays with an estimated output of 847 terawatts per discharge. We have also completed initial scans of your fleet composition and identified several areas of tactical concern in your current TR. Formation. The silence in the hall became even more profound. Several delegates looked at each other with growing alarm. But that was not the most disturbing part of her message, Zekthara continued. Dr. Grant concluded by saying, We suggest you reconsider your current approach. Perhaps we should discuss this situation more carefully before either side makes decisions we might regret. A delegate from the Crystal World spoke up, his voice ringing like struck metal. Commander, are you saying these primitive humans somehow analyzed your weapons technology in 2 hours? Not just analyzed, Zekthara replied grimly. They had calculated our exact firepower output, identified our weapon types, and assessed our fleet positioning, all from observing a single demonstration shot. He resumed pacing, his movements becoming more agitated. What followed were the most unnerving 48 hours of my military career. The humans began transmitting detailed analyses of our ships, our weapons, our tactics, and even our crew psychology. They seemed to know things about Velthari military doctrine that should have been classified secrets. The commander stopped and looked directly at a group of delegates who had earlier suggested using humans for manual labor. Maria Santos, their communications expert, had somehow intercepted and decoded our internal military communications, was listening to conversations between my ship captains, monitoring our tactical discussions, even accessing our personal logs. Several delegates made sounds of disbelief. Breaking Velthari military encryption should have been impossible for any species, let alone one that had barely achieved interstellar travel. Danny Walsh, their mining foreman, had modified his equipment to conduct deep scans of our vessels, Zekthara continued. He was mapping our ship interiors, identifying critical systems, locating weapon placements, even tracking crew movements through the corridors. His voice grew quieter, more menacing. But the most disturbing transmissions came from Jake Morrison. He began sending us psychological profiles of my officers. He knew which captains were aggressive, which ones were cautious, which ones had never lost a battle, and which ones had experienced defeat. He understood our military culture better than some of our own commanders. Zekthara paused, letting the implications sink in. Honored delegates in less than 2 days. 50,000 humans had accomplished something that the greatest intelligence services in the galaxy had never managed. They had completely penetrated Velthari military security and were using that information to conduct psychological warfare against us. A delegate with multiple tentacles waved them nervously, but surely they were just trying to intimidate you. Primitive species often resort to bluffing when faced with superior force. The Velthari commander's laugh was harsh and bitter. That is what I thought initially. I believed they were attempting to delay their inevitable defeat through clever lies and false bravado, so I decided to test their claims. He began moving again, his restless energy filling the platform. I ordered my fleet to change formation, moving from standard attack positioning to siege deployment. Within minutes, we received a transmission from Dr. Grant commenting on our tactical shift. She not only identified the new formation, but explained its strengths and weaknesses in detail. Zekthara's scales had now turned completely dark, the color of deep fear among his people, she said. Commander, your new siege formation provides better orbital coverage but creates vulnerability gaps in sectors 7 and 12. If you maintain this positioning for more than 6 hours, you will be exposed to coordinated surface orbit attacks using ballistic trajectories we have already calculated. The hall erupted in nervous chatter as delegates realized what they were hearing. These humans were not just resisting, they were actively studying and countering Velthari military tactics in real time. The psychological pressure was unlike anything I had experienced, Zekthar admitted. Every move we made was anticipated, analyzed, and countered before we could complete it. The humans were not just fighting us, they were learning from us, adapting to us, becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. He stopped moving and faced the assembly with his full attention. That was when I realized we were not dealing with a primitive species making lucky guesses. We were facing an enemy that could learn faster than we could adapt, think more quickly than we could react, and plan more thoroughly than we could anticipate. Zekthara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing every delegate to strain. To hear him, humans were not trying to survive our attack. They were studying us, preparing for a war that had not yet begun. Gathering intelligence that would serve them long after New Haven was nothing but radioactive dust. He looked out at the silent assembly one final time before concluding. That, honored delegates, was when I first began to understand what humanity truly was. Not a primitive species to be easily conquered, but a force that would change warfare forever. Commander Zekthara stood silently for a long moment, his dark scales reflecting the dim lights of the assembly hall. The delegates waited, some shifting nervously in their seats. They could sense that the worst part of his story was yet to come. After 3 days of psychological warfare, I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life, he finally said. I ordered a full planetary siege of New Haven. His voice carried the weight of old regret. in my 40 years of military service, I had conducted dozens of sieges. The pattern was always the same. Surround the target, cut off supplies, destroy key infrastructure from orbit, then wait for surrender. Most worlds gave up within days. The longest siege in Velthari history had lasted 2 weeks. Zekthar began pacing again, his heavy footsteps marking time like a funeral drum. I positioned my 12 ships in a perfect blockade formation around New Haven. No ship could land or leave without our permission. Then we began systematic bombardment of their surface installations. He paused, remembering those first attacks. We targeted their power plants first, then their communication arrays, then their manufacturing facilities. Each strike was precise, designed to cripple their civilization without killing too many civilians. Standard siege protocol calls for gradual pressure until the enemy realizes resistance is hopeless. A delegate with glowing blue skin raised one of her forearms. Surely that ended their defiance quickly? The Velthari commander's laugh was bitter. The bombardment lasted 3 months. 3 months of the most frustrating, terrifying siege warfare I have ever experienced. He stopped pacing and faced the assembly directly. The humans had anticipated everything. Every target we planned to destroy. Every tactic we intended to use. Every weakness we hoped to exploit. They were ready for all of it. Zekthera, a scales, grew darker as he continued. Within hours of the first bombardment, the entire human population had vanished underground. Danny Walsh had been expanding their mining tunnels for months, creating a vast network of caves and passages beneath the planet's surface. 50,000 people simply disappeared into the ground like ghosts. Several delegates made sounds of surprise. Most species tried to defend their surface installations during a siege. But hiding underground was only the beginning, the commander continued. What happened next defied every principle of siege warfare I had ever learned. He began moving. Again, his agitation clear to everyone watching. The humans began fighting back. It's not with advanced weapons or superior technology, but with modified mining equipment and basic physics. Zekthera gestured toward the ceiling of the assembly hall. They started launching projectiles from the planet's surface. Chunks of metal accelerated by mining charges, fired with mathematical precision that should have been impossible for a primitive species. His voice grew more strained as he remembered those attacks. Dr. Lisa Grant had calculated exact trajectories. Using the planet's rotation, the gravitational fields of nearby moons, even the solar wind patterns, these crude projectiles followed paths that exploited every natural force in the system. A delegate from the gas worlds floated forward, his voice whistling with confusion. But Commander, primitive kinetic weapons should pose no threat to Velthari. Warships. That is what I believed, Zekthara replied grimly, until the first projectile struck my flagship. The hall fell completely silent again. The humans had not aimed for our armor or our weapons, he continued. They had targeted a specific point on our hull, where 3 different metal alloys joined together. Dr. Grant had identified the exact stress point where a small impact would cause maximum structural damage. Zekthera's claws extended slightly. As he remembered the moment, the projectile was nothing more than compressed iron ore, but it hit with such precision that it created fractures throughout our hull. We lost atmosphere in 6 compartments and had to emergency seal half of Deck 7. He looked around at the shocked faces of the delegates. Over the following weeks, more projectiles found their targets. Each one struck a different vulnerability that the humans had somehow identified from their scans. They were not trying to destroy our ships outright. They were systematically weakening us, studying our reactions, learning how we responded to damage. The Crystal delegate's voice rang with disbelief. How could they possibly aim so accurately from a planet's surface? Jake Morrison had organized the entire colony into a single military unit, Zekthar explained. Every civilian became a soldier, every building became a fortress, every piece of equipment became a weapon. But more importantly, every person became a sensor. Its pacing became more rapid, more agitated. They had turned their entire population into an intelligence network. Teachers were monitoring our communication frequencies. Farmers were tracking our orbital patterns. Even children were collecting data about our ship movements. Zekthara stopped and gripped the edge of the speaking platform. Maria Santos had established communication links throughout their underground network. Information flowed from every tunnel, every cave, every hidden outpost. They knew where each of my ships was positioned at all times. It could predict our movements better than we could. A tentacled delegate waved nervously. But surely your superior firepower gave you the advantage. The Velthari commander's expression grew even more grim. That was when the humans revealed their true genius. They did not try to match our firepower.
Oh.
Instead, they turned the planet itself into a weapon. He began gesturing as he spoke, his movements becoming more animated. Danny Walsh had been doing more than just expanding tunnels. He had been studying the geological structure of New Haven, identifying fault lines, underground rivers, volcanic systems, everything that could be used as a weapon. Zekthara's voice rose slightly. They redirected underground water flows to flood our potential landing zones. They triggered controlled landslides to block our ground assault routes. They even manipulated volcanic activity to create atmospheric interference that disrupted our targeting systems. The delegates were now listening with expressions of growing alarm. But the most disturbing tactic was how they used the local wildlife, he continued. Maria Santos had somehow trained the native animals to carry small devices that monitored our activities. Birds flew near our ships and transmitted data about our hull configurations. Underground creatures mapped our landing parties and reported their movements. Zekthara paused, his breathing becoming heavier. Every attack we planned was anticipated. Every landing we attempted was met with perfectly prepared defenses. Every weakness we tried to exploit had been turned into a trap. His scales had now turned completely black, a color that made several delegates step back in their seats. The humans had advantages that no military academy teaches you to counter, he said quietly. They knew their world better than we knew, our own ships. They understood every rock, every tree, every wind pattern. We were fighting an enemy that had home field advantage taken to an impossible extreme. Zekthara looked up at the assembly with haunted eyes. But the most terrifying aspect of the siege was not their tactics or their preparation. It was their attitude. He let that statement hang in the air before continuing. After 2 months of bombardment, I offered them terms of surrender. I promised to spare their children and elderly if the adults would submit to relocation. Most species would have accepted such generous terms. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Jake Morrison's response chilled me to my core, he said. Commander, our children are learning from this experience. They are taking notes, studying your methods, understanding your weaknesses. Do you really want to teach them that surrender is an option when facing invaders? The hall was completely silent now, every delegate absorbed in the horror of what they were hearing. That was when I realized we were not fighting a normal war, Zekthara concluded. We were fighting a species that viewed every battle as a learning experience. Every attack as an opportunity to gather intelligence. Every act of resistance as a lesson for future generations. He stepped back from the platform edge, his massive frame somehow seeming smaller. The humans were not trying to win the siege of New Haven. They were using it to prepare for a much larger war that they knew was coming. And they were willing to sacrifice everything to make sure their species would be ready. Commander Zekthara walked to the edge of the speaking platform and gripped its metal railing. His knuckles turned white as he squeezed the cold surface. The delegates could see that this next part of his story would be the most difficult to tell. After 3 months of siege, my superiors grew impatient, he began, his voice heavy with old pain. The Velthari High Command had expected New Haven to fall within days. Instead, we were locked in a stalemate with 50,000 humans who refused to surrender. He released the railing and turned to face the assembly. My admiral sent new orders. The message was clear: end the siege immediately, using any means necessary. The Velthari Empire could not afford to look weak in front of other species. Zekthara began pacing again, but his movements were slower now, weighted down by memory. I was ordered to demonstrate the true power of Velthari military technology. The plan was to scorch the entire surface of New Haven, turning the planet into molten glass. No underground tunnels would survive such an attack. No human would escape. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. They had heard stories of Velthari planet-killing weapons, but had never met someone who had been ordered to use them. I positioned my fleet for maximum bombardment coverage, the commander continued. 12 warships, each one capable of cracking a planet's crust. Together, they could destroy a world completely. I gave the humans one final chance to surrender, though I did not expect them to accept. His scales flickered between silver and black as he remembered that moment. Jake Morrison's response came within minutes.
Got.
Commander Zekthara, we understand your position. However, we must inform you that New Haven is now armed and ready to defend itself. We suggest you reconsider your current course of action. Zekthara stopped pacing and looked directly at the assembled delegates. At first, I thought this was another bluff. What could 50,000 humans do against 12 warships prepared to destroy their world? But then Dr. Lisa Grant transmitted a detailed explanation that changed everything. His voice grew quieter, forcing the delegates to lean forward to hear clearly. She told us that Danny Walsh had not just been expanding mining tunnels. He had been destabilizing the planet's geological structure in very specific ways. Humans had spent 3 months turning New Haven into a massive weapon. A delegate with multiple eyes blinked rapidly in confusion. What kind of weapon could a planet become? Dr. Grant explained it with terrifying precision, Zekthara replied. They had identified specific points in the planet's crust were focused. Bombardment would trigger a chain reaction. Seismic activity would cause the planet's core to destabilize in a controlled manner. He paused, letting the implications sink in. The humans had calculated that our planned bombardment would not just destroy the surface. It would create a gravitational anomaly that would trap our entire fleet. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Several delegates stood up from their seats, unable to believe what they were hearing. Humans had turned their own planet into a trap. Zekthara continued over the noise. If we proceeded with the bombardment, the resulting gravitational disturbance would destroy not just New Haven, but every ship in orbit around it. A crystal delegate's voice rang out sharp and clear. That is impossible. No primitive species could manipulate planetary geology with such precision. Zekthara's laugh was harsh and bitter. That is exactly what I thought, so I demanded proof of their claims. Maria Santos transmitted the complete mathematical calculations. Dr. Grant provided detailed geological surveys. Danny Walsh sent seismic readings from dozens of monitoring stations throughout the planet. His expression grew darker as he remembered studying those reports. My science officer spent hours analyzing the human data. Every geological assessment was accurate. Every prediction was mathematically sound. Began moving again, his agitation clear to everyone watching. The humans had spent 3 months preparing for this exact moment. They knew we would eventually resort to planet-killing weapons. They knew we would position our fleet for maximum bombardment effect. And they had prepared a counter-strategy that would destroy us all. Zekthara stopped and faced the assembly with haunted eyes. But the most terrifying part was not their technical capability. It was their willingness to use it. The commander's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Jake Morrison transmitted our final exchange. He said, "Commander, we have armed our planet as a weapon of mutual destruction. If you proceed with your bombardment, you will trigger events that will destroy your fleet along with our world. Every species in this sector of the galaxy will know that the mighty Velthari were defeated by 50,000 humans who chose death rather than submission." Several delegates made sounds of disbelief. The idea of choosing mutual destruction over surrender went against every instinct of civilized species. But Morrison was not finished, Zekthara continued. He added something that haunts me still. We have transmitted detailed records of this entire encounter to Earth. They know you are here. They know your capabilities. They know your weaknesses. They know that you tried to destroy an entire colony of their children. How do you think 7 billion humans will respond to that information? The hall fell completely silent. Even the background noise of alien conversations had stopped. For the first time in my military career, I faced an enemy that welcomed mutual destruction, Zekthera said quietly. The humans were not trying to survive our attack. They were making a statement about their entire species. He gripped the platform railing again, his claws leaving deep scratches in the metal. Dr. Grant sent one final transmission that sealed our fate. She said, "Commander, this engagement has provided valuable intelligence about galactic military capabilities. Win or lose, humanity will benefit from this experience. We hope you will convey our regards to the rest of the galaxy." Zekthera released the railing and stepped back. That was when I realized we had already lost, not the battle. For New Haven, but something much more important. We had lost the psychological war. His scales had turned completely black now, the color of deep fear among his people. The humans had achieved something that no military strategist thought possible. They had turned certain defeat into a strategic victory. He looked out at the shocked faces of the delegates. Even if we destroyed New Haven, the humans had won. They'd gathered intelligence about our ships, our weapons, our tactics, and our psychology. They had transmitted all of this information to Earth, and they had demonstrated to their entire species that resistance was possible. Zekthara's voice grew stronger as he reached the climax of his story. I faced an impossible choice. I could proceed with the bombardment and lose my entire fleet while teaching humanity that we were vulnerable. Or I could retreat and admit that 50,000 humans had defeated 12 Velthari warships. He paused, looking around at every delegate. In the hall, both options were defeats. The humans had created a situation where we could not win, no matter what we chose. The commander stepped back from the platform edge, his massive frame somehow seeming smaller. Maria Santos transmitted one final message as I considered my options. She said, "Thank you for the educational experience, Commander. This interaction has been most valuable for our future planning." Zekthera's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the enormous hall. The humans were thanking us for teaching them how to fight a galactic war. They had turned our siege into a training exercise for their entire species. He stood in silence for a long moment before concluding. That was when I made the decision. That would define the rest of my life. I ordered the Velthari fleet to withdraw from New Haven. The hall erupted in shocked voices as delegates realized what they had just heard. The greatest military force in the galaxy had retreated from a confrontation with 50,000 primitive humans. Commander Zekthara stood in complete silence as the shocked voices of delegates filled the assembly hall. Some were arguing loudly about what they had heard. Others sat in stunned quiet, trying to understand how the galaxy's greatest military force could retreat from primitive humans. The noise continued for several minutes before gradually fading as all eyes returned to the scarred Velthari warrior. The retreat from New Haven was the most humiliating moment in Velthari military history, he said, when silence returned. As my fleet pulled back from the planet, we received one final transmission from the humans. His scales flickered between black and silver as he remembered those last moments. Dr. Lisa Grant's voice came through our communication systems. "One final time," she said. "Safe travels, Commander Zekthara. Thank you for the valuable intelligence about galactic military capabilities. This interaction has been most educational. We hope you will convey our regards to the rest of the galaxy." Zekthara began pacing slowly across the platform. As we limped back toward Velthari space, my crew made a discovery that chilled us all. During the 3-month siege, the humans had somehow planted surveillance devices on our ships. Several delegates gasped in surprise. Maria Santos had been doing more than just monitoring our communications, he continued. She had found ways to attach tracking beacons to our hulls. Danny Walsh had managed to place sensors inside our ventilation systems. Even Jake Morrison had somehow accessed our computer networks. The commander's voice grew more strained with each revelation. The humans had turned our siege into the greatest intelligence-gathering operation in galactic history. They had recorded everything. Our ship designs, our weapon specifications, our tactical procedures, our crew psychology, even our personal conversations. He stopped pacing and faced the assembly directly. We thought we were conquering a primitive colony. The humans had been studying us like laboratory specimens. A delegate with blue skin and multiple arms raised one tentacle nervously. But surely your military command understood the significance of what had happened. Zekathar's laugh was bitter and harsh. When I returned home, I faced a military tribunal for failing to annex a primitive world. The charges included cowardice, incompetence, and bringing shame upon the Velthari Empire. His expression grew darker as he remembered those proceedings. I submitted a complete report detailing human capabilities and warning about the threat they represented. The tribunal dismissed my findings as the desperate lies of a commander trying to excuse his failure. The crystal delegate's voice rang with disbelief. They did not believe your report. The Velthari High Command refused to accept that a species barely capable of interstellar travel could pose any threat to our empire, Zekthara replied grimly. They classified my report as classified fiction and ordered me to never speak of the New Haven incident again. He began moving across the platform, again, his agitation clear. For 6 months, I tried to convince my superiors that humanity represented a new kind of threat. I warned them that the humans were not interested in conquest or territory. They were interested in learning, adapting, and preparing for future conflicts. Zekthara paused and looked up at the massive ceiling of the assembly hall. Then the first reports began arriving from across the galaxy. Human ships were appearing in star systems throughout known space. The delegates leaned forward, sensing that the story was approaching its conclusion. The humans were not conquering worlds or establishing colonies, he continued. They were simply observing, making contact, and learning about other species. But every species they encountered received the same message. We come in peace. But we remember our enemies. His voice took on a tone of growing dread. Within a year, human ambassadors had established diplomatic relations with dozens of civilizations. They offered trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and technological cooperation. But they also shared detailed intelligence about Velthari military capabilities with anyone who would listen. Zekthara stopped moving and gripped the platform railing with both hands. The humans had done something unprecedented in galactic history. They had turned a single military defeat into a galaxy-wide propaganda campaign against their enemies. A tentacled delegate waved nervously. But surely this was just primitive revenge-seeking? That is what I thought initially, the commander replied, until I learned what humanity had been doing during that year of diplomatic contact. His scales turned completely black as he continued. The humans had not just been making friends. They had been recruiting allies, sharing technology, and building a network of species that were all united by one common factor. They had all been threatened or attacked by more advanced civilizations at some point in their history. The implications of this statement sent a wave of nervous chatter through the assembly. Jake Morrison had become Earth's chief military strategist, Zekthara said over the noise. Dr. Lisa Grant was now heading their intelligence services. Danny Walsh was in charge of planetary defense systems, and Maria Santos had become their chief diplomatic officer. He looked around at the shocked faces of the delegates. The 4 humans who had defied my fleet at New Haven were now the leaders of Earth's galactic expansion program. They were using everything they had learned from our encounter to prepare their species for interstellar warfare. Zekthara released the railing and stepped back from the platform edge. But the most terrifying discovery came 18 months after the New Haven incident. Human exploration ships had found other worlds where the Velthari had conducted annexation. Operations? His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They were interviewing survivors. They were documenting our tactics. They were building a comprehensive database of Velthari military operations across the entire galaxy. The hall fell completely silent as delegates realized the implications. The humans were not seeking revenge for New Haven, he continued quietly. They were gathering evidence to present to the Galactic Federation. They were building a case that the Velthari Empire was a threat to galactic peace and stability. Zekthara began walking slowly across the platform one final time. 2 years after our retreat from New Haven, human representatives requested a formal audience with this assembly. It came not as a conquered species seeking protection, but as prosecutors presenting evidence of war crimes. He stopped in the center of the platform and faced the assembly with his full attention. They had documentation of 47 unauthorized annexation operations. They had testimony from hundreds of survivors. They had detailed analyses of Velthari weapons used against civilian populations. And they had complete records of our psychological warfare tactics. The commander's voice grew stronger as he reached his conclusion. The humans had accomplished something that no military force in galactic history had ever achieved. They had turned a single defensive action into a comprehensive legal case that would change interstellar law forever. Zekthara looked directly at each group of delegates as he spoke his final words. Honored delegates, I have fought in 17 major conflicts during my 40 years of service. I have conquered worlds defended by advanced civilizations. I have faced enemies with superior technology and overwhelming numbers. But I have never encountered a species more dangerous than humanity. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. They do not fight to win battles. They fight to ensure that their enemies learn to fear them. They turn every conflict into a learning experience, every defeat into intelligence gathering, and every act of aggression against them into a recruitment tool for their entire species. His scales remained completely black as he delivered his final warning. The humans of New Haven could have died quietly and been forgotten. Instead, they chose to die in a way that would make their species stronger. They transformed certain defeat into ultimate victory. Zekthara stepped back from the speaking platform and looked out over the assembled delegates one last time. That, honored delegates, is why no one dreaded humans until now. They have shown the galaxy that some enemies are more dangerous in defeat than in victory. They have proven that the most primitive species can become the most terrifying if they refuse to accept the rules that others have made for them. The massive hall remained completely silent as Commander Zekthara concluded his testimony. The Galactic Federation now faces a choice. We can recognize humanity as an equal partner and respect their right to exist in peace. Or we can continue to underestimate them and discover what 7 billion humans can accomplish when they are truly threatened. He walked slowly back to his seat, leaving the assembly to contemplate the implications of his warning. The age of human expansion had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.